A neurosurgeon at a hospital outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, stood at the foot of my bed with my MRI up on a screen behind him and told me, in the flattest voice I have ever heard a human being use, that given the level of the injury to my spinal cord, I should not expect to walk again, and that the sooner I accepted that, the sooner I could start building what he called a realistic life. My daughter Paisley had stepped out to find coffee 20 minutes earlier, which meant I heard those words entirely alone. No hand to grab, just a monitor beeping somewhere behind the curtain and a resident standing near the door writing something down without once looking up at me. I was 61 years old, 4 months from my retirement party. A small gathering my coworkers had already started planning at the plant where I'd spent 33 years, and I remember staring at that screen instead of his face, at the grainy gray image of my own vertebrae, thinking that a man had just described the rest of my life to me in under 30 seconds, using a tone he probably used for weather forecasts. 2 years later, I walked into a 7-Eleven in Chiang Mai, Thailand, on my own 2 legs, using a cane but nothing else, bought a bottle of water and walked back out. I want to tell you exactly how a man gets from that hospital bed to that convenience store, because I don't think miracle is the right word for it, and I don't want to hand you a fairy tale when the truth is actually more useful, and honestly more encouraging than a fairy tale would be, because a fairy tale can't be repeated by anybody else, in this, at least the parts of it that were about consistency and access rather than luck, genuinely can. If you're new to this channel, hit subscribe, because I don't sugarcoat recovery stories, the slow parts or the fast parts. And I think people considering something like this deserve the whole picture instead of just the ending. I'd spent 33 years at a manufacturing plant outside Tulsa, running a line crew for the last dozen of those, the kind of steady physical work that leaves your knees complaining by 55 and your hands permanently marked up from small accidents you stopped noticing years earlier. Retirement, in my head, had looked like fishing, a garden I'd been half planning on graph paper for 2 years, and absolutely nothing resembling a hospital bed. I bring that up because I think it matters, how ordinary and unglamorous my plans had been right up until the latter, a reminder that this kind of thing rarely announces itself in advance to anybody. Let me tell you what happened, because the details matter. I fell off a ladder cleaning gutters. Of all the mundane things, 11 stories short of the height that kills a man, just far enough to land wrong on a low retaining wall. I want to be careful here, because I'm not a doctor and I'm not going to describe my own injury with more precision than I actually have. But what I understood at the time was that it was classified as an incomplete spinal cord injury, meaning the cord itself wasn't fully severed. Some signal was still getting through, which the neurosurgeon explained mattered clinically, but which, in his professional judgment at the time, still put real, meaningful recovery of walking well outside what he considered likely. I spent 6 weeks in that hospital, then a rehab facility, then home in a wheelchair, a piece of medical equipment I'd never once in my life imagined myself needing at 61, with a home health aide named Marcus coming 3 times a week to help me with exercises I mostly couldn't feel working. Marcus was a good man, patient in a way that job requires and rarely gets paid enough for, and I remember him telling me, gently, somewhere around week 10, that he'd seen guys make real gains on schedules like mine, and guys who plateaued hard, and that he honestly couldn't tell yet which one I'd turn out to be, which was more honesty than most people had offered me since the latter. Here's the part that I think doesn't get told enough in these stories. My insurance covered 20 outpatient physical therapy visits a year. 20. For an injury that every single specialist I spoke to told me needed sustained, repetitive, almost obsessive daily work to have any real shot at partial recovery, if any shot existed at all. I did the math more than once, sitting in my wheelchair at my kitchen table. A legal pad in front of me covered in the same subtraction problem worked out 5 different ways, hoping one version of the arithmetic would come out better than the others. 20 visits, roughly 45 minutes each, spread across 365 days, against an injury that the actual research on incomplete spinal cord injuries said needed daily, intensive, structured therapy for months to have a real chance at meaningful gains. I called the insurance company twice to ask if there was an appeals process for more sessions, and both times got a polite representative reading from a script, explaining that my plan's outpatient rehabilitation benefit was capped regardless of diagnosis severity. A sentence I heard so many times I could recite it back word for word months later. I wasn't being denied care out of malice. I was being given exactly what the system was built to give, which was not enough. Not by any measure that mattered to a man who still had feeling flickering in his legs and nowhere near enough covered hours to chase it. My son Wyatt, 34, an engineer out in Denver, was the one who actually found the option that changed everything, sitting up late one night after visiting me, doing the same kind of research I was too exhausted and too depressed to do myself in those first months. He came to me with printouts, actual paper printouts about rehabilitation hospitals in Thailand, specifically Bangkok. That specialized in exactly my situation, spinal cord injury patients doing intensive daily physical and occupational therapy at a fraction of what even my co-pays alone were running me at home. He'd stayed up until nearly 3 a.m. 3 nights running compiling those printouts. He told me later, partly out of engineering habit, wanting to see every number laid out before he trusted any of it, and partly because he said watching me do that same defeated arithmetic at the kitchen table every week had become its own kind of unbearable for him. I was skeptical the way anybody would be skeptical. My whole life built around the assumption that better care costs more, not less, and that assumption took a real beating over the following weeks of research. Wyatt and I on the phone most nights comparing hospital accreditations, therapist credentials, and patient reviews like we were vetting a used car instead of the rest of my mobility. Comment down below if you've ever hit a wall with what your own insurance would actually cover for something serious, because I think this specific gap between what the research says you need and what the system says it'll pay for is one of the most under-discussed reasons people end up looking overseas at all. Not for cheaper vacations, but for care they simply couldn't assemble any other way inside their own country's system. I've read enough of those comments on other channels since starting my own recovery to know I'm nowhere near the only one who's done this math at a kitchen table and come up short. What I found, once Wyatt and I actually dug into it properly, was that a comprehensive rehabilitation program at a hospital in Bangkok ran somewhere in the range of $12,000 to $25,000 for an intensive, specialized multi-week stay, daily physical and occupational therapy included, which sounds like a great deal of money until you set it against what the exact same intensity of care would have cost me piecemeal in America, where a single day of comparable specialized rehabilitation can run over $1,000 on its own, meaning that same multi-week program at home. If I could have even found a facility willing to schedule it at that intensity, would have run well past 6 figures before I ever left the building. In Thailand, daily inpatient rehabilitation, room, meals, and core therapy included, was running closer to $200 to $300 a day at the facility Wyatt found, which meant I could actually afford months of consistent work instead of the 20 scattered sessions a year my insurance back home considered sufficient. I want to be honest that this used a real chunk of my retirement savings. Money I'd planned to use very differently. A paid-off cabin on a lake I'd been picturing for a decade. But I looked at that number against a wheelchair for the rest of my life and made the only decision that made sense to me. I landed in Bangkok in a wheelchair, Wyatt beside me the entire flight, 16 hours plus a layover that felt considerably longer than 16 hours to a man who couldn't easily shift his own weight in a cramped economy seat, and checked into a hospital with a dedicated physical rehabilitation department that felt, walking in, nothing like the sterile, rushed feeling of American outpatient PT I'd gotten used to. The intake alone took most of a day. A physiatrist reviewing every scan and report I'd carried over from Oklahoma, translators on hand for the paperwork, a case coordinator named Nguyen assigned specifically to Wyatt and me, who walked us through exactly what a typical week would look like before we'd signed a single form, sketching out an actual daily schedule on a whiteboard, hour by hour, in a way nobody back home had ever bothered to do for me even once across 6 weeks of hospitalization. My program there involved 2, sometimes 3 hours of therapy a day, split between traditional physical therapy, a heated hydrotherapy pool where the warm water took enough weight off my legs that muscles which felt entirely dead on dry land would occasionally, faintly, fire, and sessions on a piece of robotic gait training equipment that essentially held me upright and moved my legs through a walking pattern over and over, thousands of repetitions, teaching whatever was left of the connection between my brain and my legs the pattern it needed to relearn. I also did, twice a week, sessions of traditional Thai massage with a therapist trained specifically in working with paralysis and spasticity patients, which I want to be clear wasn't the main engine of my recovery. The daily repetitive physical therapy was, but which did something for the muscle spasticity and general tension in my body that made the harder daily work more tolerable. I need to be honest with you about the middle of this story, because the middle is where most of these videos skip straight to the ending, and the middle is genuinely the hardest, least cinematic part. There were entire weeks where nothing changed. I'd do my 2 hours in the pool, my session on the gait trainer, my evening stretches, and feel absolutely nothing different. Day after day of exhausting effort logged into a binder Nguyen kept for my file. Numbers and repetitions that all looked identical to me by week 8. There's a specific kind of despair in doing exhausting, repetitive work every single day with no visible proof it's accomplishing anything, wondering if that neurosurgeon back in Oklahoma had simply been right, and I was just delaying an inevitable acceptance he'd already handed me on day 1, dressing the delay up as hope so I could feel like I'd tried everything before finally agreeing with him. I called Wyatt crying more than once during month 3, telling him I thought I'd made an expensive mistake and should just come home and get a good wheelchair and get on with a smaller life, and I remember him, to his enormous credit, never once telling me I was wrong to feel that, just asking me each time to give it 1 more month before deciding anything permanent. What kept me going more than any single breakthrough was a physical therapist there named Dow, who never once promised me I'd walk, which I respected more than I expected to, having had my hopes managed so brutally back in Oklahoma. What she told me instead repeatedly, standing over me during sessions when I'd get frustrated enough to snap at her, was that the nervous system doesn't always show you its progress in a straight line, and that plateau in this kind of recovery are common and don't necessarily mean the work isn't accumulating somewhere beneath what you can consciously feel. She'd point to small things I'd stopped noticing myself. A slightly stronger flicker in a toe, a session where my balance held a half second longer than the week before, evidence, I'd become too discouraged to register as evidence at all. I didn't fully believe her for a long time. I believed her finally on a Tuesday in month 5, when during a routine session on the gait trainer, my right leg, entirely on its own, without any assistance from the machine at that exact moment, took a genuine, if wobbling, step. I want to describe that moment honestly instead of dramatically, because I think honesty serves this story better. I didn't cry out or collapse in triumph. I just stopped completely still, and Dow stopped too, and we both looked at my leg like it belonged to somebody else for a second, and then she said very quietly, "Again, Hunter, try that again." And I did. And it happened again, less wobbling the second time. Dow also taught me something that had nothing to do with my legs directly, a breathing technique she used with a lot of her long-term patients to get through the specific mental grind of repetitive therapy without the frustration itself sabotaging the work. Counting each repetition out loud in Thai numbers she'd taught me specifically, so my mind would stay occupied on the counting instead of drifting into the same defeated spiral it kept finding on its own. Nuong, Song, Sam, 400 times a session some days. A small ritual that sounds almost silly described out loud now, but that got me through more bad afternoons than I can accurately count. Progress after that first real step still came slowly, parallel bars for weeks, my arms doing most of the actual labor while my legs relearned their part in smaller and smaller increments. Then a walker, heavy and awkward at first until it became almost an extension of my own hands. Then a rolling walker, which felt like an absurd luxury after months of the heavier version then. Around month 14, a single cane, which I still use today and expect to use for the rest of my life, and which I want to be clear about, because I don't want anybody watching this to think I'm claiming some complete movie-ending cure. I am not the man I was before that latter. I walk with a cane more slowly than I used to, and I still lose feeling in patches on bad days, particularly in cold weather, which is one more reason a warm climate turned out to matter more to my actual daily function than I ever expected a climate to matter to anything. My daughter Paisley flew out around month 16, having seen the whole thing mostly through video calls and Wyatt's updates, choppy footage of parallel bars and a walker that never quite captured, she told me later, how much effort was actually behind each small clip. I remember standing at the arrivals gate specifically, so she'd see me on my feet the second she came through. Cane and all, instead of finding out secondhand in some hallway, Wyatt beside me filming on his phone without me fully realizing it at the time. She stopped dead in the middle of the terminal, dropped her bag, and just stood there with both hands over her mouth for a solid 5 seconds before she moved at all, other travelers detouring around her like water around a stone. When she finally hugged me, she was shaking, and she kept saying into my shoulder, "They said you wouldn't, Dad. They said you wouldn't," over and over, like she needed to say the wrongness of that old prognosis out loud to actually believe the rightness of the man standing in front of her. We stood there long enough that an airport employee eventually asked, gently, if we needed a wheelchair. And Paisley, laughing through actual tears at that point, told him no. Thank you. We were just fine standing exactly where we were. I still go back to that rehabilitation hospital for maintenance sessions every few months, because recovery like mine doesn't have a finish line where you're simply done. It has a plateau you have to keep actively defending with continued work or risk losing ground on. I've met other patients there over these 2 years. An Australian woman with a similar incomplete injury from a car accident. A British man recovering from a stroke, a much younger American, barely 30, working back from a motorcycle accident with a determination that honestly humbled me some mornings, and none of us talk about miracles with each other, we talk about repetitions, about which exercises are working this month and which have stopped, about the specific unglamorous mechanics of a body slowly relearning something it forgot how to do. We've become something like a rotating support group, faces changing as people finish their programs and go home and new ones arrive, but the conversation itself staying remarkably constant across all of it. I think about that neurosurgeon in Oklahoma sometimes, and I want to be fair to him, because I don't actually think he was a bad doctor or a careless one. He was giving me an honest, statistically grounded assessment based on the injury in front of him, the aggregate data he'd seen across a career of similar cases, and the realistic limits of what his own system could offer me to work against it. I don't fault him for the words themselves, only for how little support existed on the other side of them. What he couldn't offer me, through no real fault of his own, was 20 hours of hands-on therapy a week for over a year. Because nothing in American insurance, at least not mine, was built to pay for that kind of sustained intensity, regardless of what the underlying science said an injury like mine actually needed to have its best shot. Thailand didn't give me a different body than the one that ladder left me with. It gave me the volume and consistency of work that the actual science says an injury like mine needed, at a price that let me actually afford to keep showing up every single day for as long as it took, instead of 20 scattered sessions a year and a doctor's honest, limited best guess. I'm Hunter. Thank you for listening to Retirement Without Borders, and if you or somebody you love is sitting in a hospital bed right now, hearing a version of what I heard in Oklahoma, I'm not telling you to book a flight tomorrow. I'm telling you it's worth asking a second question, somewhere past the first honest, limited answer you're given, about what more intensive work, wherever in the world you can actually afford enough of it, might still be able to do.